I had actually written a version of this book in like 2010, but it was more like just straight erotica. Like it was just them sex, like here, this way, that way. Because that was like when erotica was kind of big in the public consciousness. For me, when I was approaching this story, it was not my intention that it would ever be taken literally. Like I was trying to create like a fantasy.
This week, I got to talk with Eliza Jane Brazier about her newest thriller, It Had to Be You, which is a really fun take on the Mr. and Mrs. Smith dynamic. And I devoured it. It is fantastic. But the synopsis is, when Eva and Jonathan hook up on the sleeper train from Florence to Paris, they think they'll never see each other again, which is too bad because neither has ever felt a spark like this for another person. But love isn't on the agenda in their line of work. 6 months later, they run into each other in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. This meeting is not by chance because Eva has been hired to kill Jonathan. She's a contract killer, and what she doesn't know is that he is too. Their meeting kicks off a high-stakes cross-continent adventure across Western Europe. There will be tourism, there will be bodies. Eva and Jonathan might even fall for each other. As the two get closer to completing their assignments, it becomes clear that they also are being hunted by something even more dangerous than love. So fun. It is action-packed. It is steamy AF. Eliza actually said in another draft it was even steamier, so just imagine how much is left in if she felt that way. And I had a really good time talking with her about the relationship dynamic and how it carries into an action thriller. So, that being said, let's hear from Eliza. I devoured this one. I thought it was so much fun, and like I just love action thrillers, so when I saw you wrote one, I was so excited. But I wanted to know, was there anything different about writing this book compared to your other books?
Well, I will say I feel like every single book, it's different.
Yeah.
Like the whole way that I approach it and the way that it like falls apart is always different. Like there's so, and I think that's like an important thing for me to like remember, because a lot of times I'll think, oh, I've cracked it. Like I know how to write a book. But the reality is that the idea, it will tell you how to write it. If you try to force it to be like, its siblings, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So yeah, this one was probably easier in some ways because I had actually written a version of this book in like 2010.
Oh, wow.
I really liked the voice. That was like the same, like the setting. It was like a romance thing, but it was more like just straight erotica. Like it was just sex, like
everywhere.
This way, that way. Because that was like when erotica was kind of big in the public consciousness.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, I'm going to write like a really literary erotica. In my mind, at least, I thought it was literary. And so I developed the voice that was all in Jonathan's voice. And I always just really loved it. And so whenever it came time to pitch a book, I was like, I would really love to like find a way to publish this. And so I used that kind of made it easier in a way. I felt like I had the character already. I had the setting already, both characters already. So
right.
That was nice.
Yeah, that's cool. So it sounds like some of your inspiration was that there was more erotica being written at that time. But what made you want to write about two assassins who have great chemistry?
I mean, yeah, like I said, I think originally I wanted to like push it as far as I could with like traditional publishing, because I think erotica is really cool. But then I also, like my previous book, Girls and Their Horses, was a really character-driven story, and it was like multiple character perspectives, and it was like a lot of interweaving storylines. It was very difficult because of that.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to write something that was going to have like a plot that was baked into the premise. So like with this whole idea of saying they're assassins, they're going to kill each other, you kind of like know the beats that it has to hit, or I felt that I did.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a part of like the reasoning, I guess, for me, like choosing to do that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense though. Like I and kind of like action thrillers are a little bit similar to that. Like you kind of know the things they're going to go up
Yeah,
against at
exactly.
each place.
Yeah. It feels like it unspools so much more naturally. Like I definitely
Hmm.
like from the first draft to the second draft, I definitely did change things. Like there was a lot more sex scenes, like I said. So I did things, but it does feel like there's such like a story. It's like there's such a like kind of I don't know if it's like formula, but like a pattern or something that it does just feel like you've like I watch so many of those movies. Like I love those kind of like fun, like
Yeah.
action adventure, really plotty movies. So you
Hmm.
feel like naturally already in your consciousness, like you know what kind of
Hmm.
has to happen in a way. And obviously you try to give it like a bit of a spin or a twist, which I feel like
Hmm.
that's pretty easy when you're saying your characters are murderers.
Right.
That's really
um
good.
yeah. Yeah. It takes place kind of all across Europe, and like the imagery was so cool. Like I felt like I was legit in Europe, even though I've been to Spain, but I haven't been to any of the other places. Um, so I know you lived there for a little while. Did have you been to most of the settings that you included in it?
Yeah, I've been to all of them.
Nice.
I lived in London for like 10 years, and then I also used to just go to Europe. I got like a Eurail pass when I was really young and did like the whole train thing by myself for like 6 weeks and would just go all over the place.
Nice.
The very first time I went to Europe was actually in high school, and I went to Florence and took the overnight train to Paris, which they don't
Mm.
actually have anymore, but it was like
Oh,
inspired by that like specific train because it's such like a cool. I freaking
yeah.
love trains,
Yeah.
and like that experience was so like I don't remember a lot of things in my life, but I feel like
Hmm.
the experiences like that they're so memorable. They like stay with you forever. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I live in Indiana, so I have not been on many trains in my life, but it was kind of crazy because I read a book called The Man on the Train, and then I read this yearbook, and
Oh,
then there was something else. Oh, just like one of the podcasters I was talking about was talking about like how convenient the trains are. She was going from like New York to I can't remember, somewhere close to New York, but she was talking about like it's just so convenient. Like you can just like drink and stare out the window. And she was like saying all this. And like all of that happened in a couple weeks. And all of a sudden I was like, am I becoming a train person through other people's stories basically? But now I'm like so intrigued by them. And I was like Googling them like when I was reading yours too, because I was like, okay, so what does this look like to be in a train like that? But it actually seems like such a fun way to transport yourself places.
yeah. I think that trains, like especially in Europe, they're very like romantic.
Mm,
And
yeah.
it is like right, like you can just sit there, you can kind of do whatever you want, but you get to see like all this scenery. You actually like feel like
Yeah.
you're in the place. And you have
Mm-hmm.
no responsibility. Like so much better than an airplane. You don't get to see anything. The boat,
Yeah.
ostensibly, you just see the ocean.
Yeah.
Driving, you're always paranoid and thinking, "Oh, this person's going to crash."
Yep. Yeah.
The
Totally.
trains are magical. You're on your way to, perhaps a magical school somewhere.
Right. um so it's you kind of mentioned this. It's written from both perspectives. Is it Eva or Ava? I know some people pronounce it either way.
I guess I think of it as Eva.
Okay, cool. So there's Eva and there's Jonathan. So did you have more fun writing one of the perspectives?
I wouldn't say I had more fun. I feel like
Mhm.
Eva's is lighter.
Yeah.
But like I said, so I already had like the Jonathan voice is the exact same voice as the character that I'd already previously developed. So
Yeah.
Eva was more, and it was a similar character, but it was like more like bringing out that character. I think her
Hmm.
character was maybe more funny, and then like or more intentionally funny, and then I
Yeah.
think like it's like more funny just because he's like weird.
I don't know if I'm weird, but I didn't think he was that weird. I mean, I loved both of them, but I know what you mean. His is like he's more serious. So like you're saying, like if
Takes
he's
himself
funny, it's
seriously, but in a
yeah.
way it is kind of unintentionally funny because it's like a very pretentious way to consider oneself.
Yeah. Yeah, that too, for sure. So they both have really like rich and emotional backstories, and something because I love watching like action movies too. I feel like I've been reading more action thrillers this year too, but sometimes what you lose is character development in some of them. So how did you approach making them like accessible assassins?
I mean, so I think I specifically, because I wanted to talk about like an emotional, I think that's kind of important to have like an emotional heart to the center of your story.
Hmm.
So, like, I did want to talk about specifically how people have trauma in their past that leads to, I feel like there's a period in life, especially if you have like past trauma, where you're being like compelled by this trauma to do things that are like bad for you and bad for the
Hmm.
world at large. And I really wanted to talk about that in like a kind of highly symbolic way. So that was always like very much a core of the story, because it's about like getting to that point where you're recognizing that like your behavior is so damaging and where it's coming from. And now I actually want to like change and like
Yeah.
maybe like a better life. I don't have to keep like reliving this or punishing myself or whatever it is. Right.
Hmm.
So that was really important. And then like specifically so this is like kind of an interesting story.
Uh-huh.
So Eva's backstory is based on something that happened to me, but obviously it's much more dramatic. But
Okay.
in real life, I had a gun held to my head, and I was like basically robbed at gunpoint.
Oh
And
wow.
there was a point where the guy put the gun down, and
Hmm.
I picked it up, and he reached for it, and I handed it to him. And it's like obviously like in that moment, it's a very sort of obviously sort of traumatic experience. It's like you
Oh
don't really
yeah.
you're in shock, so you're just acting like impulsively. So it was
Right.
just always something that in my mind I was like, what if I kind of knew at that moment the kind of person that I was, that I would way rather someone shoot me than me shoot them. But
Yeah.
it was just like something that I always thought about, because like what if I had tried to like point the gun at them? Like what if I had tried, you know what I mean? Like certain
Yeah.
people would have handled it differently. So I always kind of
Hmm.
had that in my mind as
Hmm.
something that I thought about a lot, I guess, you know?
Hmm.
So I made it in this version. Obviously, she does shoot them, but it's a different situation too, because there are people that
Yes.
are already dead. So it's not the
Yes.
same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I loved. I'm gonna mark this because I don't know if you consider it a spoiler, but I loved that like the situation she was in as a kid. I loved the turn that like what happened to her as a kid by bad people. The way she kind of justifies her actions is that she's trying to keep other kids from having to go through what she went through. And I loved that like perspective of like how you could get to the point of killing people because you're like, oh, they're bad guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that we all like, I don't know. I think a lot of times we don't do things that are bad because we think that they're bad. And it's
Hmm.
like, especially if you have such a sort of like complicated things that have happened to you. I think we all
Hmm.
like to an extent justify things, and it's only maybe like later through like growth and reflection that we're like, oh, I just twisted that situation so much. And
Hmm.
like she talks about it in the book, it's because she feels like safe in trauma because her life was so traumatic.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a very real thing that can happen.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Bookwild. And if you are, could I ask you a favor? Could you go and rate and review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening? Ratings and reviews make the biggest difference in discoverability of the podcast, and I definitely want to find all of our fellow thriller readers out there. So if you could go rate the podcast and leave a short review, that would make a huge difference. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. So one of the cool things that I thought that I just really enjoyed was it does shift perspectives back and forth between them. And since they are assassins, you can't, like, when you're in one person's perspective, you don't know what the other person is thinking. And so sometimes you're like, who's playing who? And like, basically, like, who you're getting the information from changes. And so you can't always tell what each character's motivation is. So, did you always know you kind of wanted to do it with the two perspectives because it like added to the suspense so much?
I mean, I wanted to do it from two perspectives from the beginning, but I feel like that was because, like I said, I'd already developed the male perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like 2010 was a different time.
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted to make sure that the female character was like as strong and as important. I mean, I think she's stronger, you
Mm-hmm.
know, as one. So that was kind of like more my thinking. But I think it was also just, it was like how we talked about how just like implicit to the story, it was such like a natural flow where I
Hmm.
found it like really easy to know like where to end something and where to pick up with the other
Hmm.
because there is such like a fun kind of interplay, like where you're seeing
Yeah.
like her interpretation of something and then what the reason you're finding out what the reason for his behavior is in his
Yeah.
scenes, so on and so forth.
Yeah. The action scenes are super fun. There's like multiple throughout all of it. But I'm always wondering how people write it if they're not like, I don't know, like actively fighting people in some kind of any of the, what am I trying to think of, disciplines, fighting disciplines. So how did you approach writing them? I know some people can do it all in their head, some people like act it out physically.
I wish I did ask it out. You know, like I, to be honest, this was another thing. I like to challenge myself as a writer. I think that's super important to like making
Mm,
sure that your career like stays engaging for you.
yeah.
It should be about this journey and trying to get better. I've always felt like in my mind, I always thought, oh, I'm not good at action. Like I always had that in my head. And in fact, like when I watch like action movies, I find it extremely difficult to pay attention to action sequences. Like
Mm,
if people are sitting in a room and talking about like philosophy or something, I'm literally hanging on every word. I'm rewinding. I'm like, wait, what did they say? Like, how did they say it? Like, how did that line come out?
yeah.
Um, so it was like a huge, in a way, a challenge to me. Well, at least I guess I sort of thought it was to try to write something, but I actually found that for me, it flowed pretty naturally because it was so, every action sequence is so tied to the characters in the story,
Mm,
you know? So it's like, I
yeah.
really, like, I just sort of like, it really, yeah, like it really just sort of like came out in a way that felt like really natural. And it was
Hmm.
also like about, it's always about their relationship. They're
Hmm.
really fun, like to me at least. Like I love like the humor and the quips. And I feel like that's when you almost see like their like real relationship like come out and they're like the playful side of their relationship, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
It's like it's so much like when they're having fun together. So it didn't even feel like an action sequence to me.
Mm,
Um, yeah, it just felt
yeah.
like part of their story, which I think was like to me, I thought was really cool.
That's true. And to what you were saying earlier about like having Eva be as strong as him, and I would definitely say emotionally she's more strong
Yeah,
as well. Um, it kind of feels like they're so well matched to even be fighting each other basically.
yeah,
And they almost have like common ground in fighting essentially. So
yeah,
it's almost like it's like their shared interest that they're just like
yeah,
partaking
totally.
together.
I
Yeah.
think it's cool. Like I don't think I really realized like how much that those kind of sequences can actually like reveal character. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I was talking to Rob Hart, who wrote Assassins Anonymous that just came out this year. And he was saying, when I asked him that, he was saying that when he teaches writing action sequences, he talks about how like musicals and action thrillers or action is the same thing. So like with musicals, like all of this emotion and like relationship dynamics like build and then they burst into song about something. And so he was saying like that's how he approaches action as well, is just that like all the relationship things are happening and then like they just burst into action. And I was like, I'm never gonna stop thinking about action being like musicals.
I love that. And I love musicals.
I know. I was like, this is like that. I
I'm
like
so
the most unexpected answer that I was just totally not expecting. But I was like, huh, that is like the same thing. Like it's just a lot of emotion happening in motion, basically. But the other thing that I'm always intrigued about with assassin thrillers or just even just action thrillers in general where there's a lot of killing is that you can really explore that like gray area of who is good and who is bad. So how did you kind of like make sure that the readers felt like they were still the good guys?
you know, I a lot of people ask this, and I think that for me, when I was approaching this story, it was not my intention that it would ever be taken literally. Like
Hmm.
I was trying to create like a fantasy,
Hmm.
uh, but the world is obviously very similar to our world, which makes it kind of not feel like a fantasy. But like that's like
Right.
how I approach it. Like if you have a sort of fantasy, I feel like if I had a dragon and then I had a hero who kills hundreds of people, it wouldn't matter. Like you'd be like, okay, because there's a dragon. It's not real.
That's
But
true.
it's kind of like harder, I think, in a way, maybe to accept it in the real world. But ultimately, I think that I hopefully, because I was approaching it in a way that, like, this is just supposed to be a heightened version of an emotional truth. Like, you're
Mm-hmm.
never really supposed to believe that they're killing people, and you're never supposed to sit there and think about the people they killed, or like, what about their
Right.
families? Or who was
I
it?
know.
You know what I mean? Like it's almost like to me, like I always wanted it to be like this symbolic thing of like I
Hmm.
think that everyone, or yeah, probably everyone, you go through like phases in life where you do things that are, I think, harmful.
Hmm.
And that's like what it was about, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that hopefully that people don't think of the characters as sort of good or bad
Mm.
because I never saw it that way. Like hopefully that comes through
Yeah.
in some way.
You do kind of have to, like, even when you're watching action thrillers, you're right, because you're not sitting in the theater like grieving every person who
No.
dies. You're just like, ooh, cool, they're winning.
Yeah, totally. Imagine if you're watching The Mummy and you're like, oh no, that poor
Yeah,
explorer, like treasure hunter. What about
right.
his kids?
Yeah, I like that idea of like action as fantasy almost, because it really is like,
Yeah.
because you're kind of like watching it like a video game too, where you're kind of removed from it being like people. You're just like, is my hero winning? So
Yeah. I mean,
I like that perspective.
well, and like every story really is a fantasy. There's just some people that are going to approach it from this way of, I'm going to try to trick you into thinking this is real. In fact, you might even think
Yes.
it's more real than your real life,
Yeah.
like the verisimilitude. But to me,
Right.
I'm never aiming for that.
You're right, because it's like I was thinking about that before my camera stopped. I was thinking that same thing where like we kind of know that like stories are not real life, and like that's why they're more exciting and engaging. Like if someone like wrote a book about my life, it would be so boring. So it is kind of like to have an enjoyable story. You don't totally want it to be like grounded in reality, really.
We're all lying.
Maybe some people.
I'm just lying more authentically.
Yeah. Totally. Um, so the other thing I thought was cool is the name is It Had to Be You, which is like a very romantic, or like it's used so much in romance novels. But then it works so well in the thriller genre as well. So how did you come up with the title?
Okay, if I remember correctly, I think I pitched it with the title. And I
Oh,
feel like it
nice.
just was one of those like titles that it kind of to me worked on like the two levels of it being like it
Mm-hmm.
had to be you in terms of like of the person I met by chance and like had a thing for or whatever, and then now I'm like assigned to kill you. Like there's like that kind of like, oh, like why did it have to be you? Then there's also like that kind of like it couldn't have been anyone else. Like you're the perfect person for me side to it, which I
Yeah.
really, it just felt like it just totally worked instantly. Like sometimes it's like easy, I
Yeah.
feel like, sometimes it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But you know what I later found out? Like I never had seen the one. What's the one with Keanu Reeves, John Wick, and it's in
Mm-hmm.
like that movie. There's like they use the song between him and his like love interest, and I was like, oh,
Oh, really?
like
I
yeah,
did not realize that.
or
Oh,
something. Yeah.
that is so cool.
Halfway through the movie, there's like some sort of scene where he's like dancing with his old love, and their song is playing or something.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
the
whatever.
beginning of
Of course,
that
you
movie
got it.
is
Like we're
hard.
all the same, you know,
Yeah,
relation.
that is so cool. I haven't seen it in forever. I saw the whatever that was, fourth one last year, but I hadn't seen the first one in so long.
Yeah, I actually
But
read the
I
script.
love
I guess
them.
if I'm being honest, that's where, and then I was like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I love those movies. They're so good.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Um so I have been also asking people if they've read anything recently that they loved.
Oh my god.
If you haven't, that's okay too.
I read comes out today. Oh, I read two books that come out today, but it's not going to be
Nice.
released today because this is a podcast. Um,
Yeah.
I read May Cobb's Hollywood Assistant.
Yes.
I really liked that. It was so fun. It really like I
Yeah.
was May. I read it like so fast, and
Mm-hmm.
it really like was very transportive. I don't know. I don't usually like
Yes.
books that are like have just beautiful descriptions and stuff.
I know, me neither.
But like I really was like enjoying it. Like she does it in such a way that it's still engaging and it's still like a fast
Yes.
read, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
then I also read Rachel McGuire. Um,
Yes.
that came out today, On the Surface. And actually,
Yes.
well, they're a writing duo, but one of them is my
Mm-hmm.
mom's neighbor.
Really?
Yeah, so I actually blurbed her book, but I was like, damn, this is like really good. Because I've talked to her over the years because always knew she was a writer and she had written, I think, different age categories and stuff. And then she was like, oh, I'm getting this book published. Would you want to blurb it? And I read it. Like, you never know. You're like my mom's neighbor. Who knows? And I read it and I was
Right.
like, holy crap. I'm like, this is really good. Like, to the
It's
point
so
where I
good.
was like, man, this is inspiring me, actually.
Yeah. Is it Leanne or Rachel?
Rachel.
Rachel. Yeah,
Mm.
what's crazy is I just released episodes with May Cobb and Rachel McGuire today. So those
Oh,
are
good.
like perfect ones. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. They were so fun. I mean, May's always fun to talk to, but Rachel and Leanne were cracking me up. We were having so much fun talking about their book.
She's really cool. She's always
Yeah.
really nice to me. So
Yeah. It's a really fun one. I loved that. And the colors matched your book
oh
as
yeah,
well.
I
I was
know.
like looking at everything I'd posted and like the like 7 out of the 8 books I've just posted about all have like prominent blue in their cover. So apparently
There
in
must
July of
be some kind of
2024.
study or AI
Yeah.
like decided that this is like what makes people buy books.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's
It
all because
must be.
of Hypothesis. I think that was a very popular book, and it's pink and blue. Now I keep seeing people
Yeah.
there years later.
Yeah. Well, I obviously always love covers with pink, as everyone knows at this point. So I'm here for it. Where should people follow you to stay up to date with everything?
I guess Instagram.
Yeah,
I won't keep them too up to date though. Let's have a little
that's okay.
history.
Well, I'll post about whatever your next one
Yeah,
is so
our
they can keep
backyard.
following me. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about it and for writing it because I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me and for
Yeah.
reading it.